Our next reader, Sheri J. will be reading from her memoir, Coming of Age in an Inner City Funeral Home. Sheri is a writer, poet, spoken word artist, and teacher. She's also the author of 2 poetry books, One Woman, One Hustle, and Vook, I Am the Poem. She's traveled the U.S. speaking, reciting, and performing poetry in 2007. She lived in rural South Africa, where she helped to teach journalism skills to African women and worked as an editorial assistant for an international literary magazine. Sheri has written for Urbanite, Channel, the Amazwi Villager, the East County Times. She has an M.F.A. in creative nonfiction from Goucher College, and she is currently teaching at the Baltimore Leadership School. Please welcome Sheri Booker.
Hello, how are you? All right. Great. Well, that's good to hear. This is my memoir, 9 Years Under, Coming of Age in Inner City Funeral Home. I used to work in the funeral business for 9 years, from the age of 15 to 24. So 1997 through 2006, I was working in the funeral business. So I'm going to share a little bit of my story and my experiences. I'm going to skip around a little too. Baltimore had become a metropolis of death. The blackened streets were often stained with blood, roped with yellow tape, and draped with guilt and shame. Warning shots no longer ricocheted through the air like fireworks. A new breed of marksman was hitting his target. Gunshot wound to the head, multiple gunshot wounds, whatever it took to make sure the victim never breathed again. Bullets and black-on-black violence caused the pool of men that I should have been dating to shrink each day. Every time I turned around, there I was, ordering a nameplate for another one. I know immediately just by looking at their names, Dante, Jarrell, Tavon, Rashid, that they were young homicide victims. Many of them had criminal pasts. Some were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The majority were under 30. More and more of them hadn't even earned a high school diploma. They'd be warned by their praying grandmothers and hopeful aunties and often whisked off to church for intervention. They give their life to Christ, attend a few services, and memorize the lyrics to Kirk Franklin's crossover gospel hits. But when the streets called, they always answered. I once saw a boy walk down the aisle of a church, vowing tearfully to dedicate himself to God after a convincing sermon by the preacher. 2 weeks later, that same boy was in our basement. Often the shooters were just babies themselves. Whether they'd suffered their own loss of a loved one, succumbed to drug abuse, or had their spirit broken through incarceration, they never grasped the value of life. Some had fathers who were locked away in prison, or who had been gunned down, or mothers who were strung out on drugs, or out on the streets doing what they needed to do to get a fix. They were young men who raised themselves because their grandmothers just couldn't do it anymore. And so when they were old enough to become errand boys for the local dope dealers, or to be initiated into one of the local gangs, they found something to kill for. The streets were so deadly that people started calling the city Baltimore Murderland. We weren't living in Charm City, it was Harm City. Even in cases where a gun was not the weapon, the autopsy results still read blunt force trauma to the head, multiple stab wounds, or something else tragic and inhumane. Mr. Wiley was often left to perform major reconstructive work, like a surgeon suturing the bodies that had been hacked open by the medical examiner. Although he wasn't saving lives, he was saving face, literally restoring the physical features for the afterlife. Gangbangers and dope dealers were not the only ones caught in the violence. There were many innocent bystanders too. The flashy boys with real jobs and nice cars who were killed over a botched robbery or carjacking. The young guys whose only sin was having good taste. Our tiny little corner with the lovely canopy didn't fool anyone. The Wiley Funeral Home fell right in the middle of it all. My father slept with his police radio on, and I could hear the 911 calls from the neighborhood come in through the night. I'd strain to listen to the cross streets when I heard a homicide called in to see if we had a chance of getting the body. The calls were almost always from the neighborhoods surrounding the funeral home, and the perpetrators that my father had to interrogate in the middle of the night had probably walked past our building earlier in the day. And I loved soaking it all in. And my parents' attempt to give us a better life, they kept us far away from the action of the streets. I'd hardly step from my own front porch to walk alone in our safe neighborhood. My bedroom wall was plastered with Lion King posters, and I spent my Friday nights with encyclopedias and note cards. I was the studious, innocent baby of the family my parents expected me to be, but I felt like I had missed out on the very experiences that made their childhoods rich. The West Baltimore that they grew up in was long gone. They both managed to escape, unlike many of the people they had grown up with, before crack took its toll and the affluent families moved out of the neighborhoods. Some of their childhood friends ended up in jail. Some ended up on welfare, others ended up on drugs, and some ended up downstairs in the basement of the funeral home. My father's family still lived on the west side, and when I visited my grandmother, Big Mama, I had a taste of all the things I longed for. I ran through the alleys of her neighborhood playing hot butter beans with the rest of my cousins, jumped off porches, and climbed the walls. The permanent scar on my chin came from a day of play in the hood. But as I got older, we stopped visiting Big Mama's house as often, and I lost that connection. However, I didn't lose my curiosity. I was infatuated with the hood. Many of my friends and family members grew up in environments similar to Gilmore Street, and while they all wished to escape to my house for sleepovers and weekend getaways, I always wanted to run to theirs. I dreamed of buying penny candy and now-and-laters from the corner store, soaking my chicken box in salt, pepper, ketchup, and letting yakame noodles from the Chinese joint swell in my stomach. I couldn't disguise that I was from the other side of town. All my friends told me that I didn't sound right when I cursed. People who called the funeral home often thought I sounded like a white woman. Even Miss Angela made fun of me and called me a librarian on days when I styled my hair in a bun and wore my gold-rimmed glasses. The other day she called me Sister Bertrille because she said I acted like a nun, but I wasn't holier than thou, and I wanted everyone to know that. All right. Thank you. So I always like to mix it up, give a little seriousness because we're dealing with the topic of death, but then I like to do something a little funny. So I'm going to tell you again, I worked there from the time I was 15 to 24. This next story that I'm going to read, this is me at about maybe 21. I'm at the College of Notre Dame in my senior year. I've worked in the business long enough to know not to do what I am about to do. So basically I went to pick up this body from another funeral home. And on the way back, I get a phone call from one of my coworkers, and here's what happens. I was on my way back to the funeral home when I received a call from Miss Angela. "Where are you?" she asked anxiously. "I'm on Franklin Street. I worried that I had forgotten something at the other funeral home." "Good. Can you stop at McDonald's and get me a big and tasty meal on your way back?" Again, I'm driving this van, and there is a dead body in the back of this van, and Miss Angela just asked me to stop at McDonald's and get her a big and tasty meal. "Sure," I agreed. The noonday mix played on the radio as I sat in the lunch hour line with the cars wrapped around the double arches. Since it looked like we'd be there for a while, Billy hopped out to grab a pack of cigarettes from a neighboring gas station. I shouted my order at the intercom. When the line finally moved, I quickly whipped around the corner, but not before smashing the rear end of the minivan against the guard pole. With my bumper attached to the pole, I turned back to check on Miss Griffin. The body bag was still intact, but my heart was racing like I had been in a head-on collision. I was embarrassed and had no idea what to do next, especially since everyone in the parking lot was staring at me. The front of my car was too close to the wall to move forward, so I thought the only way to untangle myself was to shift into reverse. Only by doing that, I smashed the rear end into the guard pole even more. The sound of crushing metal seemed to be getting louder and louder. I shifted the gears from reverse to drive, and after going back and forth, I was finally able to separate the car from the pole. Again, I looked back to check on Miss Griffin, who lay there quietly, unaware of the commotion. The McDonald's workers from both window 1 and 2 poked their heads out to see what all the noise was about. Embarrassed, I drove on to the first window where I paid the cashier. "Someone does this every day," the young worker tried to console me. Looking back through the side mirror, I saw a rainbow of car paint on the pole, but it was no consolation for my plight. I was terrified that the body in the back was still not in one piece. When I returned, I asked Billy to take a look at the back of the car. He almost choked on his cigarette when he saw the damage. It had basically been a fender bender between my vehicle and an inappropriately placed pole, but the damage on the car looked like it had been rammed by a tractor trailer more than once. Just looking at the car, it seemed like I should have been hauled off in the ambulance, or that a passenger in the back seat would have lost a limb. Thank the Lord I wasn't in here. "You all right?" That made me feel worse. as I realized that I would have to take the blame all by myself. Yes, I'm all right. I just hit the little garter pole thingy, and Mr. Wally is going to kill me. He nodded his head in agreement. What should I do? Call him. I dialed the number, hoping he was still on the service, but he answered on the first ring. Hey, how's your day? I asked, trying to mask the anxiety I felt. Good. I'm on my way back to Gilmore Street. You got my body? You're gonna fire me, I told him. I had seen people get fired for much less. Why? What's up? I was just in an accident in the van. Where? Are you all right? Where's Billy? He's right here. I'm fine. I cringed because I didn't want to answer the rest of the questions. Where's my body? She's in the back, but she's fine. What happened? Did you call the police? No, because I was the only car involved. I hit the yellow pole in the drive-thru at McDonald's. I could hardly bring myself to say it aloud. You took my body to McDonald's? Miss Angela, I'll call you back. He hung up abruptly. That meant he needed to think. Brandon crashed cars all the time, but there were never human remains involved. I hated messing up, and I knew I let him down. Is he going to take the damage out of my check? If so, I would be paying it back for years. The next few moments seemed to go by in slow motion. We rolled back to the funeral home in silence and then parked in the garage. I went upstairs to Miss Angela's office and waited to be disciplined while Cousin Billy stayed downstairs to help Miss Griffin out of the van and assess the damage. Miss Angela just kept saying, "Child." Billy came upstairs soon, looking glum too. We all knew this was bad. Then Miss Angela jumped up. Come on, Billy, let's go eat our food before it gets cold. Right then, Mr. Wally called me on the intercom. Booker, come to the basement. He wasn't happy. I walked down and into the dressing room and stared at the wall in front of me. Are you sure you just hit a pole? Yes, I am so sorry. Darn, what kind of pole was that? He then turned to Brandon, who was still inspecting the body. How is she? She's full. She just had a big and tasty meal, he joked. I gave him the evil eye. This was no time for jokes, especially not at my expense. Brandon unzipped the bag and transferred the body to the embalming table. I hated that he was there. I didn't want him to see me reprimanded. I had spent my entire tenure trying to be perfect, and with one lapse in judgment, I was realizing that I might have lost it all. Pop, come here. This woman doesn't have any legs. Mr. Wally walked over to the body and looked. Where are Miss Griffin's legs? He shouted at me, his face stern this time. Judging from the damage to both the car and the body, it wasn't a big leap to think that Miss Griffin's legs could have been lost in the accident. Huh? Did you look in her bag? It was the first thing that came to mind. I knew I hadn't checked the body bag before leaving the other funeral home, and my mind was swirling. Nothing made sense anymore. Come here, he called me over. I walked into the embalming room, and poor old Miss Griffin was on the table legless. Instead of looking at Mr. Wally, I stared at the wall just as I had the first time he told me to 6 years before. I looked for Billy. He was nowhere to be found. I was on trial all alone. Vehicular manslaughter. I had managed to kill a corpse. Mr. Wally and Brandon burst into laughter. They had already known that this woman was an amputee before they tormented me in the basement. Miss Griffin had died from diabetes, which more than likely explained why she was without legs. What would make you take my body through the drive-thru? I don't know. Miss Angela asked me to stop. I had worked there long enough to know that you simply don't drive someone's deceased loved one through the drive-thru of a fast food restaurant. It was negligent. Later that evening, Mr. Wally called me with an estimate of the damage. $3,000. But he also told me he'd see me at work on Wednesday. I offered to let him take the damages out of my check. That's why we have insurance, he told me, and that was the end of it. These readings, we only get 15 minutes, so I really have to choose what I want to read. So today I couldn't read about, the brawls that we had between mistresses and widows. I couldn't read about the time we had to drag this body out of this tiny row home on Appleton Street, 600-pound man. I couldn't really read about the shootouts and all of the other craziness that we had, the time we mixed up the bodies. But I will have books on sale over there if you want to read about it. So before I leave, I am a poet at heart, and so when you work in the funeral business, you're either really busy or you're not busy at all. And so on days when we did not have a lot of work, I would write poetry. So one day I was at work, and I was sitting there looking through a pile of death certificates, and I wrote this poem. I breathe today. I breathe a breath of refreshment, a breath of realization, a breath of thanksgiving, and I realize that breathing is much more refreshing, definitely a blessing, and I am grateful for my breath because someone stopped breathing today. So I breathe a breath of sincere satisfaction and relief that they will rest in peace. Someone else is breathing artificial, inauthentic, unnatural breaths, and it's killing them softly. Someone's breathing is controlled by machines of forced life support, and their life is cut short because they thought a man-made machine could save them. And I breathe, and I breathe, and I breathe, and I breathe, because I thought that I would never breathe again. And so I breathe for every sister that stopped breathing at the hands of some trifling man. I breathe for every child that never breathed because a selfish mother sacrificed her seed. I breathe for every punctured lung injured at the hands of envious, ungodly spirits. I breathe for every lung that collapsed from carrying burdens from one lung to the next. I breathe for every asthmatic lung that's had the wind knocked out of it. I breathe for every short-lived conversation. I breathe for every long-winded preacher. I breathe for everyone that's waiting to exhale. I inhale and I breathe 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 and I breathe. Thank you.